All right. All right. As Norm mentioned, I had a stake in this technology I'm going to be talking about today for about, I guess, 8 or 9 years, and we'll get to that a little bit later. I'll move this over here. So. A little closer. Okay. Talk a little bit about this. Most of what I'm going to be talking about turned to a little bit of a research project for me because there are some areas that I wasn't actively involved with. So if there are anybody here today that wants to dispute my research, please let me know, and we'll get some more facts on the table. Just as a beginning on the outline, I want to talk a little bit introduction, and then I'm going to be talking about 4 areas of bioprocessing research that have come about, including microbial enhanced oil recovery, talk about biodesulfurization, biodenitrogenation, and viscosity reduction, and biocracking. And then I'll wrap up with a few conclusions on where we are today. Just as an introduction, I think it's probably common knowledge, but the U.S. government spent probably more than $100 billion on energy R&D in the last 50 years. This actually just represents about 1/3 of the nation's total energy expenditure, with the rest coming from the private sector, but influenced greatly by the government through tax incentives, cost sharing, etc. And this funding led to a lot of alternative technologies and processes, including bioprocessing. A lot of the work that was done was through observations through the reservoir itself and in situ bioprocessing that was going on. And of course, the Genesis petroleum is driven by the microorganisms that are present in the reservoir. So the mitigation, alteration, maturation, everything through the production of the oil is highly influenced by the bacteria that are present in the reservoir. Reservoir conditions, temperature, pressure, and salinity also influences the bacteria that are present, and gave us a multitude of organisms that we were able to exploit during these bioprocessing research projects to get the desired response that we wanted, whether it was to remove sulfur, nitrogen, metals, etc. The reservoir microbial populations, as I said, they do shape the final oil product, and as such, we set out to use them. Now, the first things that were observed was just through natural seepage. People began to notice that when the seepage occurred, it actually served as a natural carbon source for the microorganisms, and that maybe they might be able to take advantage of this process to bring something into the field for petroleum research. There's natural and applied bioremediation. Of course, we've used it for oil spill cleanup as well. And as I mentioned, the microbial activities led to these 4 areas of research that I'm going to talk about now. Microbial enhanced oil recovery was first mentioned in a book in 1913 by J.B. Davis. He wrote about the use of microbes in his book, Petroleum Microbiology. Little was said after that until about 1926, when a gentleman named J.W. Beckman from England postulated that if the oil, which was still in the reservoir, with the gas was in solution, could be contacted with microorganisms, particularly, potentially the enzymes that they produced, could affect some desired changes in the oil that they would like to see. And maybe this would even cause a new flow of the oil where it becomes stagnant and was left standing in the reservoir. There's also a mention in the literature of the USSR engineers and geologists suggesting the same type of use of the microorganisms, but there's nothing else beyond the mention of that. Because of the Cold War that was going on, there was no release of the information at that time. And even today, there's been very little uncovered as to what they may have been doing at that time. In 1940, a gentleman named Claude Zobel actually became very active in this area, and he showed that sulfate-reducing bacteria could release bitumen from not only laboratory test columns, but also from the Athabasca tar sands. So this led to some patents that were released in 1944, describing a process where this could take place. And then a very active area of research began in the 50s. Not only Zobel, but also Beck, up to Graf Bren, and a lot of others started actively researching this particular concept. The concept was based on the following molecular level mechanics. They wanted to use a hydrocarbon utilizing microorganism who would be non-pathogenic, of course, and endemic to the reservoir. And from that, they would ingest hydrocarbons. At first, they were using things like molasses and substances such as that they could metabolize and produce byproducts that would affect the changes that they would like to see in the reservoir. These byproducts included alcohols, gases, acids, surfactants, and polymers. And what they were looking to do was to see a marked improvement in the in the rock, where the rock was being basically cut off, the porosity and the permeability being affected by just the act of producing the oil itself. It could change those properties and thus start releasing the oil in the reservoir. These were the mechanisms that were identified at that time. Acid production could potentially dissolve the carbonate rocks and other mineral deposits, again, reestablishing the permeability and porosity. Same for dissolution of sulfur minerals. Could potentially produce gases. The gases would be used to form a new drive, just a gas drive, just as you would in a production of oil. Biofilm development on solid surfaces. They could physically displace the oil, and even production of biosurfactants that would change or reduce the interfacial tension at the surface of either the water in the oil or the oil in the rock. And viscosity reduction. If you could reduce the viscosity of oil, of course it would be easier to move the oil out of the reservoir. Then in the 1950s, several oil companies in America got interested in this particular concept, and we started seeing some field tests that were being conducted. The goal for them was to increase the oil displacement and volumetric efficiency, and so if it would work, that would be great. They could do that. They rejected sulfate-reducing bacteria. They felt like it would be too dangerous and would cause too many corrosion problems, so that was pretty much done away with. So Zobel's work kind of ended there. But the first primary target that they did, they actually used this bacteria called Clostridium to ferment molasses, as I mentioned. That was their feed for the microorganism in the oil wells, and that they could produce enough gas and organic materials that they could potentially move more oil out of the ground. These field demonstrations went on in the 60s and 70s. You had pretty much two sets of people on the fence. You had people that said this would never work, and other people that continued to try to do the field demonstrations and prove that it could. A new concept came about at that time, and that was that they could produce enough biomass that downhole that they could fill the permeable water zones and divert the water flow, and in effect reestablish the water flood. This led to limited technical and economic success, and this is kind of small, but this is just a diagram at the time of what they were doing. You had a skid with the MER injection materials, the microorganisms, the feed for the microorganisms, et cetera, that were injected along with the water into the well. At the present, hundreds of MEOR projects have taken place worldwide, and there's been a lot of papers in the literature. Just in SPE alone, I counted about 55 papers. A lot of these are targeted at paraffin wax removal, stimulation of reservoirs, injection well projects, water flooding, etc. But work still does go on. And there's actually several independent oil companies implementing the technology. Bioconcepts, Oppenheimer Biotechnology, ATEC. There's quite a few in the literature that you can basically hire if you're interested in doing this type of project. So there were some benefits to this work that have led to the other areas of bioprocessing. There were new organisms isolated that were used further in other projects and found some new uses of those particular cultures. So once they did that, then it started feeding the other technologies that were taking place. Also an increased understanding of microbial ecology. And there were some other projects that came out as well, including bioleaching of metals and biotreatment of spent catalysts and wastewater. So MEOR still is alive today, but it's a very small effort. Of course, it's moved out of the oil companies into the small independents that can make a living on something a little bit more on the edge. There's also a lot of work going on in South America as well. We're going to move on to biodesulfurization. This is the project that I was most involved with in the 90s, and the history actually begins in 1950s. There was a series of U.S. patents that came out. Most of these were devoted to desulfurization of coal using biologic materials. These are some of the sulfur mechanisms that they were looking at in coal, including chemical and microbiological. They were actually using these in concert. And these were what was being looked at in the 50s. And this led to biodesulfurization work in the 70s and 80s. At that time, the US DOE and other companies were sponsoring research to improve, complement, or even replace hydrodesulfurization. There was a big push at that time to start removing sulfur. Regulations were starting to come out that Jeff discussed earlier, and I'll show you a little bit later, and to reduce the sulfur emissions. This is just a chart that has the sulfur compounds and its efficacy of the HDS process on the particular compounds. Of course, the non-thiophenic and even the small thiophene and benzothiophenes were very easy to hydrotreat. And even the non-substituted dibenzothiophenes were actually very easy to hydrotreat. But once you started getting to the beta-substituted dibenzothiophenes and the larger benzonaphthothiophenes, it became very difficult for hydrodesulfurization to attack these particular compounds. And this has led to a large body of work that still exists today. The reason that BDS was being looked at was because of the downfalls of HDS. That it was a high temperature, high pressure, and hydrogen requiring process. And they were expensive to build and operate. At this point in time, if another process didn't exist, the companies were looking at building additional units or even hydrotreating 1, 2, or 3 times to try to get down to the levels of sulfur that were required. And again, as I said, doesn't work very well on those larger polyaromatic heterocycles that we were talking about in the previous slide. This was chosen as the model compound for biodesulfurization work. This is dibenzothiopene, unsubstituted but easy to work with. It was chosen because these thiophenic compounds were present in both coal and heavier fractions of crude, and it was used in a series of microbial enrichment and selection techniques. So this was basically used as the hydrocarbon source for a microorganism, particular microorganism, to see if it grew on that particular substrate or not. At first, in the late 70s and early 80s, what were called successful isolates were found, but what was found was that they weren't actually removing the sulfur without attacking the hydrocarbon, but they were actually solubilizing the molecules, both the polyaromatic sulfur-containing hydrocarbons, but also the hydrocarbons themselves, the naphthalenes, etc., and basically removing them from the oil. So there was a loss of fuel value, and therefore not really successful. And the turn of the key happened in 1989. A group at the Institute of Gas Technology actually found an organism which they dubbed IGTS8 that was able to liberate the sulfur in the DBT without attacking the hydrocarbon. So at this point in time, a huge boom went out in the industry. We finally found an organism that's able to do this, and not only that, that if you can find one, maybe you can find another that could do that. So it led to a very sustained development effort. In the 1990s, you could find over 25 institutions, both in the US and abroad, that were researching biodesulfurization. Energy Biosystems Corporation, the company that I worked for at that time, actually provided the most effort and dollars over that period of time. And I'm actually going to kind of concentrate on what they did, because even though there were other research institutions that were working on this as well, they were actually just almost doing the same kind of work that Energy Biosystems was at a different pace. And the fact that they could put in the kind of money and manpower that they could, we were able to reach these goals a little bit faster. So I'll probably say EBC and we interchangeably, and I apologize, but I still kind of feel this is my company. But anyway, in the early 90s, they licensed the organism IGTS8, and they did a lot of work in it, and it's such a shame to put it into one line that they elucidated the 4S pathway, because this was years and years of work that took place to get to this. They also cloned, sequenced, and characterized the genes that were responsible for the desulfurization process. And this is an illustration of both the 4S pathway and the genes that are responsible for the reaction. So if you started with the model compound dibenzothiopene, you reacted in the presence of oxygen, NADH, FMN, and 2 of the gene products, DSCC and DSCD. You get your first product or step in the process that's dibenzothiopene sulfoxide, and then very quickly, same addition, same components here that are necessary. You get to dibenzothiopene sulfone. These steps are very quick, and actually this middle step was very difficult to isolate and to find that this particular thing was happening. But we get to the dibenzothiopene sulfone, and I want you to remember the sulfone because this becomes very important later. Then in the presence again of oxygen, NADH, FMN, and a new DSCA as well as DSCD, we do another step and get to the phenol sulfonate. And then very quickly, again, these last two steps take just almost no time at all. There's a loss of sulfate in the presence of DSCB to 2-hydroxybiphenyl. So a lot of years of work went into this. I'd have to venture probably 3 to 4 years. And again, as I said, this is taking place not only here at EBC, but in the universities, in Japan. A lot of different places are working on this technology, and it was a big rush to find out who was going to get to be first and get this into the literature. From there, Energy Biosystems did a lot of work, as did a lot of other institutions, on expressing the genes themselves in a variety of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. The hope was that we would be able to get it into an organism that would be more able to survive the process conditions, because this was being envisioned as being placed directly into the refinery environment, so that it would have to put up with the high temperature oil that's coming off the line, etc. So we had to find an organism that was fairly robust and able to handle this. Also in this time, the activity was amplified 1,000-fold from the original IGTS-8 isolate. And again, as I said, we were working on other ways other than the gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria to find a biocatalyst that could survive the harsh conditions of the refinery. Parallel efforts were going on from the very beginning. I joined the company in 1992 upon its move to Houston. They were actually started at MIT, in a little engineering lab at MIT. And from the very beginning, Energy Biosystems was intent on running their efforts in the biochemistry and the microbiology section in parallel with engineering, so that they would have a process ready when the biocatalyst was ready. So the whole time that we were doing all the microbiological research, there was also an active engineering group that was working on everything from product separation to process schemes, high cell density fermentation. So there's a lot of activity going on. In fact, when I started, there was about 15 employees, and by the time we got to the end,
no contract, charge the whole free talking thing, rollover, and
people. This is the process itself that they, in the end, went with the pilot plant. Up in the corner there, you can see a batch stirred reactor that contained a biocatalyst in a water-based stream. The bioreactor in the center, we were looking at just a huge batch stirred reactor with pH control and chemical addition. From there, went out to a separations process. Desulfurized product oil was taken off. The biocatalyst and even some remaining oil that inadvertently just went with the catalyst itself was sent down to another separations unit. Sulfate was removed. Biocatalyst was removed. We would clean up the biocatalyst and send it back to the reactor and add fresh biocatalyst as needed to continue the process. So this was a continuous batch stirred reactor process. This is our pilot plant. It was actually constructed in Houston at MW Kellogg and then transported to a facility in St. Louis at Petrolite. So this was actually run by Petrolite personnel in St. Louis. And at the bottom, you can see the large batch stirred reactor on the right-hand forward side, and then the separations equipment at the bottom, and supporting equipment at the top. So we got a long way. This is about 2002. At this time, as everyone knows, the sulfur regulations were changing fairly drastically as what was going to be required in the future as far as sulfur in gasoline and diesel. And just as an aside, we were working in projects not only in desulfurization and gasoline, but also diesel and crude oil. So we had a lot of processes going on at the same time. The big crux of the problem became, are we going to have an active enough biocatalyst to do commercialization? We were basically, in my opinion, chasing a moving target, because when we started, we were only going to have to meet, 500 ppm sulfur. Then all of a sudden we were chasing something that was 50, and now it's 15. So these are the regulations that we were looking at here. In 2000, we were looking at gasoline being around 250 and diesel 450 ppm. The number in parentheses is the California requirements, and of course they're being more aggressive than the rest of the nation, and we're slowly catching up to them. But by the year 2005, we're down to 90 and 30. So these are the regulations that we were looking down the pipe at. And in Europe, it was much the same. 350 milligram per kilogram sulfur in diesel in 2000, and 50 milligram per kilogram sulfur in 2005. And we were working with a lot of different companies, including Total in Europe, so these were other regulations that we had to keep our eyes on as well. So, in answer to that, EBC redoubled their efforts in the Biocatalyst work and how they were going to increase that activity to the point that they would be able to commercialize this process. They started working with outside companies, including a company called Maxigen, and Maxigen started doing some high throughput screening technology, or if you do some gene shuffling and then you put it back through a desulfurization process, have you achieved a better organism to do the job? And at the same time, Energy Biosystems was working on a technology that they termed Ratchet at their company. Well, it was actually working a little bit better than Maxigen's, but when push came to shove, Maxigen basically put out a lawsuit on EBC and said that you're infringing on our license agreement and we're taking you to court. Well, that was the last thing that Energy Biosystems needed, because at that point in time we were 9 and 10 years down the road and we're still not to a point where we're making money, and we certainly couldn't afford a lawsuit. So it actually went to arbitration, which was good, and Energy Biosystems was feeling good about that and thought that they'd be able to come out of that okay and prove that the Ratchet technology was not something that Maxigen developed, and therefore they would be able to go forward with their technology. But they did rule against them in the end. So Maxigen won the arbitration, and Energy Biosystems had to go without using the Ratchet technology for biodesulfurization. So at that point in time, Energy Biosystems had no choice but to pare down its workforce and its efforts. And in 2002, they actually, what I call, reinvented themselves and named themselves Enkyra Biotechnology Corporation. They literally laid off the entire engineering group and stuck with just the microbiological and biochemistry groups. And all their efforts went into high throughput recombination technologies. And they started, again, on their own, trying to get this biocatalyst that they needed to get to achieve this commercialization step. Well, they were never able to get there, and the lawsuit was really the last straw. That was the last financial straw, and they were not able to get any more funds after that. So the company folded in 2003 and had to sell off its assets. And I actually kept a little bit of stock so that I could get the annual reports and such, so I could kind of find out where everything went. And it's kind of interesting because, of course, our people are all over the world now, but the desulfurization technology itself went to a company called Diversa. And one of our key scientists is actually working at Diversa, so I think it's kind of interesting that that's ended back up in his lab. So I'm not certain where they're going with it right now, but I think they got it for $200,000, so basically for a song. There's a few pockets of BDS research that remains. The knowledge that was gained through Energy Biosystems work has spurred some new work. What's going on today is not really biodesulfurization, but some alternate techniques that can kind of go into two categories. The first is absorption of sulfur from liquid fuels, followed by HDS of the concentrated fraction. And the other is an oxidative desulfurization, basically using chemicals or ultrasound, followed by the separation of the resulting sulfones from the fuel. And that's why I wanted you to kind of pay attention to the sulfones. It has a chemistry such that you can easily pull it out of solution and thereby get the sulfur out of the fuel. So those are the two realms of research that are taking place today. Changing gears a little bit, I talk about denitrogenation. Of course, the petroleum industry is also faced with the need to reduce nitrogen as well. There's also a class of heterocyclic nitrogen-containing aromatics that are difficult to attack via the standard process. The bulk of the research that I know of is going on at the University of Alberta. And some work took place at the University of Houston, and this was actually an offshoot of Energy Biosystems itself. One of the gentlemen that came from MIT to Houston to start up the engineering group actually said, "I'll come, but you're taking me out of my PhD research, and therefore you're going to have to reinstitute my work so that I can get my PhD when the time comes." So we worked out with the University of Houston for him to get his PhD there under Dr. Richard Wilson. And he did some work on biodenitrogenation based on some work that was already being done at the University of Alberta. They took a similar approach to biodesulfurization. They used strains of bacteria screened for activity on carbazole, and as you can see, this is an analog to dibenzothiopine with nitrogen as opposed to sulfur, so this was a good model compound. And search was on for a microorganism that could produce a free amine that might be more amenable to HDN. And as I said, a lot of work had already been done at the University of Alberta. They'd already found a large number of isolates, and they found a couple of promising strains, particularly a carbazole-degrading pseudomonad. So Philip Gibbs, this gentleman that I was just speaking about, did some more work there at the University of Houston, and he isolated the enzymes and characterized them, and even went to the next step, which was finding the genes that encoded the enzymes and cloned those. And then he started working on the metabolic pathway, and you can see how this kind of mirrors what we were doing at Energy Biosystems, but for a different process. And everything he did worked really well, but in the end, what we found was that you made some changes to the compound, but you did not get to that final step that you wanted to get to remove that nitrogen molecule. So that's where that stands today, although there's still a lot of work going on at the University of Alberta. Changing gears again, I want to talk about viscosity reduction and biocracking. Again, a lot of this research is being done at the University of Alberta through Murray Gray's group. And the idea is that if you can affect a change in a very large molecule and produce smaller molecules, that you will affect the viscosity and thereby make it easier to hydrotreat or desulfurize or whatever you need to do. You can see a lot of sulfur and nitrogen compounds that are here in the heterocyclic materials, just like you saw for the biodesulfurization and the biodenitrogenation. So some work was actually done at Brookhaven National Lab by Eugene Permusic, and he reported biocatalytic modifications, including all the things that we wanted: viscosity reduction, nitrogen removal, metals removal. He basically felt that if you could attack these kind of molecules with the right microorganisms, the structure would basically fall apart and release the metals and the nitrogen, and everything would be wonderful. And actually, in one of my symposia, I think it was probably about '96, he showed some slides, and they just looked great, but he couldn't really elucidate on the metabolic pathways. It was just, it works. So, Eugene showed that yes, we saw some reduction in metals and nitrogen, et cetera, but we needed a lot more information, given what work had already been done by Energy Biosystems, et cetera, to find out what was behind this particular work. And at Oak Ridge National Lab, there was actually some work going on there as well. Avjit Baroli has been doing some work on, again, a synergistic approach to biodesulfurization and biocracking. He's using thermophilic enzymes to degrade the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and affect the ring opening that we were talking about, and the breakdown of those big molecules into smaller molecules. And by far the largest efforts being done by Dr. Murray Gray, as I mentioned, at the University of Alberta, number of graduate students working on this particular area. His main areas of research include biological ring opening, a process they're calling BioArc, using a pseudomonad, and I honestly don't know if it's the same pseudomonad that was identified by the denitrogenation process or not. But as I said, they've got a number of isolates that they've been working with over the last 10 years. Again, it's supposed to open the aromatic rings into the more desirable hydrocarbons for hydrotreating. They're also working on biocatalysts to achieve viscosity reduction by selectively cleaving the sulfur bridges that hold asphaltenes together. So you can see the ideas all in concert. It's basically take a really large molecule and make smaller molecules out of it. So that's the viscosity reduction and biocracking, and that's where it stands today. So just in conclusion, and kind of wrap up where we are. Bioprocessing has been actively researched for over 75 years, and again, most of it through not only monetary incentives, but also tax incentives, et cetera, from the federal government. The MEOR technology advanced from the laboratory to the field and actually is still being practically applied today in the United States and particularly in South America. I saw a lot of applications in South America. Biodesulfurization research, it's kind of flamed out, did a lot of good work, and I think we could have got there if the sulfur regulations hadn't been so fast and furious down to this 15 ppm level that we're getting down to, but didn't get to where we needed to. Chemical and absorption processes for sulfur removal have really taken the forefront in the research that's being done today. Penn State has a very active group, Sulfco, Unipure. There's a lot of people that are attacking these particular methods today. And biodenitrogenation, viscosity reduction, and the biocracking efforts, they continue but are still just pretty much infants compared to the other two technologies that I talked about. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Have any questions you'd like to ask Lisa?
Yeah, I have kind of to increase and enhance research. And in something like this that is biologically involved, there are often, it seems to me, other federal agencies that want to clamp down on this kind of research because of the fear of some Andromeda strain kind of thing. Do you find that that makes it difficult, or are they just a part of the process of doing it, just that's a regulation and a group that one has to convince is, you know,
Yeah.
you're not going to destroy
Well, it's a good question. We did have to make sure that any organisms that we were going to work with couldn't cause a problem to the health. You know, we had to work with the strains of organisms that were proven non-pathogenic and such. So yes, that was a concern. But as long as we were working in those particular strains, then we didn't have any regulatory concerns from those types of agencies. So we were really very free to do our work as long as we stayed away from those.
Any other questions?
Jeff?
You mentioned in your oxidative desulfurization process, one of your little steps said clean up of the Biocatalyst, and then put, what's involved in cleaning up a Biocatalyst? Just curious.
I didn't see any particular projects. I saw a lot more in the literature on actually the cleanup of contaminated waste. So, for instance, British Petroleum is shut down the refinery in Casper, and they're using a huge biocatalytic process to actually clean up the ground, and they're turning it into a golf course and everything else. But I didn't see any particular processes for biocatalysts, just a mention in the literature that it's being used for that. So I can't cite any particular efforts. Yes, sir.
The end of almost every refining process, before the wastewater goes out, biologically treated, process called biox. Right? And you haven't talked anything about that. Are there any major research areas going on to improve that?
I didn't look into that, so I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much again. It's always intrigued me